Welcome to Episode 5 of Chasing the Stick, the history of Naughty Dog during the PS4 era. My name is Max Roberts. I decided to break up the 6 parts of my history into individual episodes as well, for more choice for you, the listener. This episode focuses on the tumultuous and generation-long development cycle of The Last of Us Part 2. I hope you enjoy. Part 5, The Last of Us, Part 2. Managing the Kennel. Quote, "It's hard to describe the immense pressure of following up the first game." End quote, Neil Druckmann. Before jumping into 2018, I want to touch on some developments for The Last of Us Part 2 that I either glossed over or skipped while talking about The Lost Legacy. Specifically, a key hire that the company made back in July 2016, just 2 short months after releasing Uncharted 4. Hallie Gross was hired to be the co-writer of The Last of Us Part 2. Gross has written episodes of HBO's Westworld and TNT's adaptation of Snowpiercer. The earliest inklings of her working at Naughty Dog are a string of funny tweets with model weapons for motion capture. Gross would officially announce her involvement with the project when the game was revealed at PSX 2016. The PSX 2016 teaser was also paired with a PSX panel, hosted by Greg Miller featuring Neil Druckmann, Ashley Johnson, and Troy Baker. The panel was a great move to give fans tiny bits of information for a game so early in development. Druckmann shared the story of when he pitched both the Left Behind DLC and his idea for The Last of Us Part 2. It shows us how early an idea can come around. By no means will this initial pitch be the entire story fans will experience in the final game. Druckmann said as much in an interview with Luke Winkie for Variety on June 13th, 2018. Quote, "I fooled myself thinking that I had a good idea when they were all really bad. So I'm glad we got to take a break with Uncharted 4 so I could take a break for an extra 3 years to think about these characters and what kind of story would complement the first one well. The first ideas were very plot-driven and focused on some surface stuff, and I lost sight of what made the first game special. This very core, primal idea of unconditional love a parent has for their child. We didn't have a clean idea. It was just a bunch of plot points and twists." End quote, Druckmann said. The core of The Last of Us Part 2 story would be revealed in the opening minutes of the PSX 2016 panel. Quote, "If the first game was really like the core of it, the theme was about love between these two characters and how we build that through story, music, interaction, gameplay, mechanics. This story is the counter of that. This story is about hate, and how we use all those same things to make the player feel that through Ellie this time." End quote, Druckmann said. Another interesting tidbit from the panel was in regard to the one-night live event that Naughty Dog and Sony held back in 2014 before the launch of The Last of Us Remastered. Baker mentioned how it was nice for Johnson and himself to dip their toes back into the roles of Ellie and Joel in a non-canonical epilogue. Druckmann would chime in with a corrective, "Well..." For those that could not attend in person, fans immediately took to the internet to share what the final, live-only scene was. Naughty Dog was silent about The Last of Us Part 2 for the bulk of 2017, a noticeable trait considering the generation so far. It had to help having The Lost Legacy take the spotlight. The team considered putting something out at E3 2017 for The Last of Us Part 2, but decided against it to avoid going through a grind so early in production. The Last of Us Part 2 would step back into the spotlight in October 2017 with a gruesome cinematic, clearly reinforcing the violent world and hate-focused story. Often dubbed the hanging cinematic or the hammer scene, the trailer shown off at Paris Games Week 2017 is intense. It does not shy away from graphic violence. The entire scene is done in one shot or a oneer, giving the scene a flow and immersion. Both the scene and the game are intentionally designed to elicit a visceral reaction from the player, while in the larger scope of the story, provide a commentary on violent actions and their consequences. Naughty Dog would once again close out the year with a PSX panel. The panel was much larger this year, with 7 people from the game: Neil Druckmann, Hallie Gross, Ashley Johnson, Troy Baker, Laura Bailey, Victoria Grace, and Ian Alexander. The panel revealed quite a bit about the development process, from the original cast returning to their roles to new actors and writers stepping into the beloved franchise for the first time. The discussion was insightful and entertaining. One moment that got a huge reaction from the audience was when Druckmann mentioned that after Gross's first day on the job, in the context of the game's story, she had successfully, quote, gotten someone pregnant, end quote. Neil also claimed that the game was 50 to 60% done and confirmed that gameplay would be revealed at E3 2018, which would be Sony's last E3 for the generation, something we weren't aware of at the time. Before the big annual press conference, Naughty Dog had some positive leadership promotions to share for a change. On March 9th, 2018, President Evan Wells took to the company blog and announced that Druckmann was being promoted to Vice President of Naughty Dog. Druckmann would continue with The Last of Us Part 2 as the creative director. To fill the slot of game director for the upcoming title, Marginau and Newman were promoted together as co-directors. Amelia Schatz and Richard Cambier were announced as the lead designers on the game. This wave of promotions made me think of Naughty Dog's leadership structure. The studio is relatively flat in terms of structure. If an artist needs to talk to a level designer, they have the ability to just go speak to the individual. People are mostly responsible for themselves. There are team leads and then directors, but a key missing component was producers, at least an average quantity of producers for a studio of its size. Quote, we don't have producers. We don't have a lot of process. So we really kind of rely on a lot of trust and a lot of personal relationships, end quote, Anthony Newman said in a job pitch video to encourage people to apply for game design roles at the studio. Naughty Dog has seemingly always had an aversion to producers. Wells talked about how producers slow progress, creating bottlenecks or hoops to jump through for the developers. Naughty Dog has always thrived off that garage developer feel since the beginning. Despite its size, Naughty Dog has always kept a flat structure. During a video interview with Andy McNamara of Game Informer in 2012, Wells and Balestra expressed their goal to keep that tightly woven feeling. Quote, Evan, it's something we think is very important to never let our size to, inject too much bureaucracy or too much BS, and try to cut through it. We keep things simple. Christoph and I are still very actively involved with the development of the games, and that's true across the board at all the levels, leads and directors. Everyone's hands-on. Christoph, it's getting harder and harder for us. Evan, it is. We got an amazing team, but I think by allowing everybody to do what got them into this industry in the first place, what they're passionate about, and not just sort of burdening them with a ton of management responsibilities and sort of taking the joy out of their job, it allows us to keep that spark going, end quote. Even after Uncharted 4's brutal development cycle, Wells defended the studio's lack of producers. Quote, producers become a crutch, where it's someone else's job to make that communication. We want people to get out of their chair and get the help they need immediately, end quote, Wells said in an interview with the LA Times. There may be a shift in that culture, though. During the development of The Last of Us Part 2, Druckmann tweeted out praise for their producers. The studio definitely has them now, but presumably not as large of a team as other AAA developers. It is a small but mighty team. People are expected to handle themselves. Jason even describes it in Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. Quote, it was an unorthodox management style, which was something of a tradition at the studio behind Uncharted. Naughty Dog staff liked to emphasize that, unlike other game studios, they didn't have producers. Nobody's job was simply to manage the schedule or coordinate people's work, the role a producer would fill at other companies. Instead, everyone at Naughty Dog was expected to manage him or herself, end quote, Jason wrote. From what I can gather, it sounds like game designers almost fill this role of a producer to a certain degree. They are put in charge of specific levels and help shape them into existence. It makes sense with the studio's primary goal being to marry storytelling and gameplay. Amelia Schatz briefly describes it in the same game designer job pitch video from May 2015. While this video is essentially marketing for the studio, I believe the designer's speaking in it. It lines up with interviews I've read and the culture I sense from the team. Quote, at Naughty Dog, designers are sort of almost kind of at an assistant directorial position of like, I'm in charge of this level and I need to be in contact with all the different departments and make sure that no one has anything that is holding them up, end quote, Schatz said. Alongside this lack of numerous producers, which could be a factor that contributes to the studio's consistent crunch, job titles are more organically acquired rather than assigned up front. Druckmann, Marginau, Newman, Schatz, and Cambier were all likely doing their new titles for months on end before receiving an official title. Quote, titles don't really matter. The way things work at Naughty Dog is like you do a responsibility for a while, and then people start organically working with you as if you have that title, and then you get that title. It's not the other way around. So you have to kind of prove, you have to earn it before you get it. You don't need the title to get the respect and to do the job. You just do that job, and then you get the title, end quote, Druckmann said during the Retro Replay retrospective on The Last of Us. Evolving Ellie. True to their word, the next reveal did take place at E3 on June 11th, 2018. Sony's E3 showcase was a weird one. They only showed off 4 exclusive games, The Last of Us Part 2, Ghost of Tsushima, Death Stranding, and Marvel Spider-Man. Attendees moved from location to location, while the stream cut to a stage where PlayStation staff discussed and revealed smaller trailers. The show opened with The Last of Us Part 2, though. The audience was inside a pop-up church, mirroring what was to come in the demo, but first, series composer Gustavo Santaella would play a new song from the game. The demo kicked off with a cutscene that takes place inside a church during a community dance, with Ellie off to the side drinking. After getting dragged out onto the dance floor by her friend Dina, Ellie clearly becomes more shy and lacks confidence. The two share a kiss as the game uses a pan from behind to transition to Ellie slicing an enemy's throat in a forest. Then, the gameplay begins. The gameplay was strung with tension. Ellie can now crawl to lie low, and she can jump on command. The enemies she is fighting are the same foes from the Hammer scene at Paris Games Week 2017, which is obvious thanks to their signature disembowelment technique. Combat is the same claustrophobic encounters from the first game, with improvements to both player options and realism. Ellie can hide under cars, but her enemies can look under cars and drag her out. No place felt safe in the demo. The enemies each had their own names and called out specifically to one another. This is one new element that tries to humanize enemies while commenting on violence and its consequences. These characters have lives, friends, and families in this world, even if they are trying to kill you. The gameplay portion ends with Ellie taking out 4 people inside a small shop. The player can now squeeze Ellie through tight spaces for quick flanks and to escape enemies in pursuit. Players may also craft explosive arrows. The gameplay ended with a bang, to say the least. The demo transitioned back to the dance for a final line, and then it was over. Nearly 2 years after its announcement, the world finally saw the game in action. It was a clear evolution of the original gameplay, enhanced by the PS4 and new technologies to make the world more believable than ever before. Later in the week, an E3 Coliseum panel with Druckmann, Marginau, and Newman was held to discuss the demo. The panel offered an interesting look inside the thought process of the directors on the game. Marginau talked about how the core philosophy for the game is, in a word, tension. As a sequel, the team wanted to tackle how to expand upon the solid foundation of the original game. They focused on how to connect Ellie to the environment, which ultimately connects the player to the space. By allowing Ellie to squeeze in tight spaces and lie down in tall grass, the world gains a more tangible feel. The team also looked at how a person of Ellie's stature would handle themselves in close-range melee combat. Players can now use a dodge in fights. With the ability to jump on command, combat areas are designed with verticality in mind. Even the stealth has evolved to be more analog. Factors like Ellie's stance and grass thickness play into how hidden the player is. On paper, it reminds me of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater's take on stealth, which had a percentage that changed based on terrain and what camouflage you equipped. The enemy AI was also enhanced to lean into this grounded game world. Besides each enemy having their own name, they communicate via whistling. When spotted, the information on your location spreads out through their whistles. All the enemies in a space are not immediately locked in on your location. We would later learn that all characters even have a heartbeat, which impacts the rate of breathing and sound effects that characters produce. All of this is done for the sake of immersion and realism. Quote, every kind of new element we add, we're really focused on having a lot of elegance, having few mechanics that deliver a lot of options that really increase the dimensionality of the gameplay space, end quote, Newman said during the panel. Outside of the intricacies of the demo itself, Naughty Dog had also been tailoring its reveals to create an arc. Each reveal built upon the previous one, slowly revealing tiny bits of the game. Compared to Uncharted's bombastic demos and reveals, this methodical approach of what to reveal and what not to reveal was different for Naughty Dog. Another stark difference from previous game announcements was the silence in regard to the game's release date. Quote, we've learned our lesson. We're not going to say the release date until we are very close to release. So, we're not very close to release is the only thing we'll say, end quote, Druckmann said when asked at the very end of the panel. Release would be just over 2 years away from that statement, but unfortunately, the lesson didn't pan out in the end. I imagine the team was filled with excitement and energy generated by the demo, just like they were with Uncharted 4. It would propel them through the remainder of 2018 and into the new year. After E3 2018, Naughty Dog was a tiny bit more open about the development process for the game. On December 21st, 2018, Druckmann tweeted out about how they had shot the, quote, most complicated and heart-wrenching scene, end quote, that Naughty Dog had ever made. Even Johnson chimed in before the Christmas holiday to comment on how heavy the week's shoot was. 4 months later, the team would shoot both the final scene for the game and conclude shooting the cinematics. For the bulk of 2019, major developments were not revealed. With Sony skipping E3 2019, it wouldn't be until September 24th, 2019, that the proverbial Tommy's Dam of information would burst. On that day, Sony aired a State of Play video, where a new trailer closed out the show. Continuing the tailored arc for the reveals, the trailer picks up the day after Ellie and Dina dance and kiss. It showed off new gameplay and finally revealed Joel, who had not been seen since the original teaser, where no one even saw his face. The trailer closed with a release date of February 21st, 2020. Druckmann published a blog post both on the PlayStation blog and on Naughty Dog's site, detailing the game's various additions and a smidge about the game itself. The Last of Us Part 2 is the studio's most ambitious title ever, making it the longest and largest game to date. The game is so large that it may span 2 Blu-ray discs, like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Final Fantasy VII Remake. 2 days later, on September 26, the press shared their previews for the 3-hour demo that they got to play while the State of Play was airing. Even PlayStation shared an Inside the Demo video for fans around the world to watch. Key takeaways from the new demo were new enemy types, both humans and infected. Human enemies can now have dogs that follow Ellie's scent. New and improved infected types were shown off too. The new is the Shambler, which chases Ellie down and bursts a cloud of spores. The improved is a Stalker, which shows up as a mini boss fight inside a garage. A shocking reveal was the fact that the game would not include the Factions multiplayer mode from the first game. As press previews rolled out, the lack of a multiplayer mode was slowly confirmed. The Last of Us Part 2 would be the first Naughty Dog game in 11 years that would not include an online multiplayer mode. Later in the day, Naughty Dog tweeted out the following statement. Quote, we wanted to address multiplayer in The Last of Us Part 2. As we stated, the single-player campaign is far and away the most ambitious project Naughty Dog has ever undertaken. Likewise, as development began on the evolution of our Factions mode from The Last of Us Part 1, the vision of the team grew beyond an additional mode that could be included with our enormous single-player campaign. Wanting to support both visions, we made the difficult choice that The Last of Us Part 2 would not include an online mode. However, you will eventually experience the fruits of our team's online ambition, but not as a part of The Last of Us Part 2. When and where it will be realized is still to be determined, but rest assured, we are as big a fan of Faction as the rest of our community and are excited to share more when it's ready. End quote. Bruce Straley would even chime in via Twitter on the next day. Straley said he knows the ambition of both the single-player and multiplayer for The Last of Us Part 2, and the separation and delay for Factions would be worth the wait. Naughty Dog themselves provided an inkling of what that ambition was in a multiplayer design pitch video they published in October 2017, well into the development of The Last of Us Part 2. Quote, "What we don't want is multiplayer to feel like a mode. We want it to be almost its own game, its own experience. It might start with an idea world, or an idea of a mechanic, or even more recently, a certain feeling that we're after. And then we will explore, okay, what kind of world can evoke that feeling? What kind of mechanics can evoke that feeling? What kind of psychological situations can we put multiple people in that speak back to the theme of what we're after?" End quote, Druckmann said. When I hear them pursuing a certain feeling, it takes me back to the original Factions multiplayer when the game launched. The multiplayer excelled at creating tension. When thinking about Naughty Dog's driving force of connecting the player to a story and experience through the controller, it's easy and exciting to entertain all the possibilities. It is interesting to think how the scope of Factions could have grown. Games are growing larger year by year, not just Naughty Dog games either, so it's not surprising that The Last of Us Part 2 would be cut into 2 experiences to possibly avoid even more crunch to hit the February 2020 deadline and allow the team to, frankly, make more money by presumably selling both games individually. In the end, The Last of Us Part 2 will have cost millions of dollars and working hours to create. Unfortunately, Naughty Dog would not be able to keep their goal of sticking with the announced release date when the game was near completion. On October 24th, 2019, a month after the release date announcement, Naughty Dog delayed The Last of Us Part 2 to May 29th, 2020. Quote, "As we were closing out sections of the game that we realized we simply didn't have enough time to bring the entire game up to a level of polish we would call Naughty Dog quality. At this point, we were faced with 2 options: compromise parts of the game or get more time. We went with the latter, and this new release date allows us to finish everything to our level of satisfaction while also reducing stress on the team," end quote, Druckmann wrote in the blog post. The delay allowed Naughty Dog to make the game they wanted to without having to cut corners. Jason Schreier reports that more crunch happens because of delays. In his story, which was spawned after the delay of Cyberpunk 2077 and the Avengers game in January 2020, Jason even mentions The Last of Us Part 2, citing Naughty Dog's, quote, "workaholic," end quote, tendencies. These tendencies would come to light in the coming months. Coming into 2020, the excitement for The Last of Us Part 2 began mounting to new heights. In February, I ended up buying my first 4K TV, which unexpectedly brought my hype to the top. In earnest, it got the ball rolling on this whole piece. The original game would even win quite a few Game of the Decade awards as the 2010s came to a close. As May 29th drew closer and closer, Naughty Dog and PlayStation wanted to give fans hands-on time with the game. They planned to attend PAX East 2020 in Boston and give fans an hour-long demo, the same snowy patrol demo that the press played back in September. This would not come to pass, though, as Sony made the decision to withdraw from PAX East due to safety concerns related to COVID-19. Naughty Dog did state that they would have more to show closer to the game's release. The next chunk of news would seemingly come out of nowhere. On March 5th, 2020, HBO announced that Druckmann and Craig Mazin, the creator behind the network's Chernobyl, would be turning The Last of Us into a television series for HBO. This would replace the film announced nearly 6 years prior. It's not hard to imagine that having Gross and Shannon Woodward at Naughty Dog helped bring Druckmann, Mazin, and HBO together at a table, since they are both involved with successful HBO series. With a sequel on the horizon, there's even a chance the show could include narrative from it. Almost a week later, Druckmann would announce that composer Gustavo Santaolalla would be doing the music for the show as well. Mazin briefly discussed when the show would ramp up production on his podcast Script Notes with John August. At the top of the episode that aired on March 10th, Mazin mentioned how the story needed length that a movie could not provide, hence the decision to make it into a show. The production should kick off in earnest when The Last of Us Part 2 wraps its own production in April or May. I'd imagine that Druckmann would focus on the show and its efforts while Naughty Dog pursues the multiplayer game revolving around Factions. Endure and survive. It wouldn't be a cornerstone AAA game release without the Jason Schreier article on the studio's crunch, and The Last of Us Part 2 is no exception. On March 12, 2020, over 2 months before the game was scheduled to be released, Jason published his crunch expose on Kotaku. I recommend reading it. To try and avoid crunch, Druckmann and the leads planned out as much of the game as early as possible. Narrative beats and features were planned out up front. But before the E3 2018 demo, Naughty Dog ran playtests. It was during this time that the studio realized that certain characters were not clicking with the audience, narrative beats weren't matching up. So Druckmann and the lead team began making changes, and the scope of the game grew. It needed more time and space for the narrative to develop, and thus more game to tell the story on the stick. While this kind of revision is normal in game development, it adds months of work. Jason reports that by the end of 2018, nearly a year and a half before the game would release, most of Naughty Dog was in crunch mode. This doesn't mean that Naughty Dog would be in sustained crunch for a year and a half, but it does provide a glimpse into the mindset of the studio. From the article, it sounds like bottlenecks in the pipeline played a factor, whether waiting to get feedback from a lead or having more pressing work plopped onto the desk. It sounds like the studio struggled with how to juggle so many tasks and move forward at a reasonable pace. Schreier goes on to talk about how Naughty Dog had lost 14 of the 20 non-lead designers from Uncharted 4 since its release. The loss of talent had resulted in hiring less experienced employees, which had a much steeper learning curve to nail down the perfectionism that is a staple at the studio. Even when the game was delayed from February to May, the crunch train did not slow down. Naughty Dog wanted to keep the pace. Schreier even reported that in mid-February, Naughty Dog was able to persuade Sony to delay its production of the game disc by 2 weeks, giving the team even more time for polish and crunch. The fallout after the article was an equally interesting time, filled with subtweets and Twitter threads. I feel like chronicling the entire fallout would not be beneficial to the entirety of this piece, but I will pull a few choice examples. The same day that Schreier published the article, former animator Jonathan Cooper created a thread on Twitter. He started with a tweet to the article and said, quote, "So proud to be a part of this studio," end quote. Later in the day is when Cooper sent out his thread. I've decided to copy it below for you to read and for posterity. Quote, "When I left Naughty Dog late last year, they threatened to withhold my final paycheck until I signed additional paperwork stating I wouldn't share their production practices. They finally relented when I assured them that this was most likely illegal. The truth is, I have no awful crunch tale. The story animators, as we were known, were averaging 46 hours a week when I left, and I personally never went over 55. The story team is super organized, and we reacted to whatever was thrown at us. That's not to say others weren't suffering. For the demo shown last September, the gameplay animators crunched more than I had ever seen and required weeks of recovery afterwards. One good friend of mine was hospitalized, at the time due to overwork. He still had over half a year to go. There have been others since. The reason I left is because I only want to work with the best. That is no longer Naughty Dog. Their reputation for crunch within LA is so bad, it was near impossible to hire seasoned contract game animators to close out the project. As such, we loaded up on film animators. While super talented, they lacked the technical design know-how to assemble scenes. Similarly, the design team ballooned with juniors to make up for the attrition of key roles. Every aspect of finishing this game took much longer due to the lack of game experience on the team. Don't get me wrong, these kids are mostly awesome and the best were great. It's just when the junior-senior ratio is out of balance, things can really grind, and more time is spent training than actually working. LA teams make sure and pick them up when all the contracts end. Contract work is a huge part of the LA ecosystem to ship large games. Unlike game design, there's a thriving animation industry here, and seasoned animators can, often, choose their projects. Most of the contract story animators quit last year. Those that don't can be at ND for 2-3 projects, with pauses in between, and while paid overtime, never receive benefits or the security of a full-time gig. This is the way the industry is moving, so workers need more protection rather than the carrot of a full-time job, quote, one day, end quote. There are ND stories worse than this, but like everything on my Twitter, I'm focusing on animation. For The Last of Us Part 2 fans, the game should turn out great with industry-leading animation. I would just not recommend anyone work at Naughty Dog until they prioritize talent retention. Ultimately, ND's linear games have a formula, and they focus test the shit out of them. While talented, their success is due in large part to Sony's deep pockets funding delays rather than skill alone. A more senior team would have shipped The Last of Us Part 2 a year ago, end quote. Cooper's tweets drew a lot of attention, particularly the comment on a more senior team being able to put out The Last of Us Part 2 a year sooner. This lent credence to Schreier's reporting about so many employees that worked on Uncharted 4 leaving since its release. Cooper had celebrated his 5-year anniversary at Naughty Dog just 1 year prior in March 2019. He planned on staying as long as they let him continue to push the envelope in video game animation. Cooper left later that year. Over the next 2 days, Druckmann made a couple of not-so-subtle but positive tweets about the studio's animation team and the production team. Other Naughty Dog employees chimed in too, all seeming proud of their work and their team members. This is a part where chronicling the responses would be tedious and feeds into the "you had to be there" vibe this kind of social network dialogue creates. Cooper even threw up some more tweets, and the cycle continued. To be frank, I've been writing this editorial since February 2020. Therefore, any developments on The Last of Us Part 2 after that time get incorporated where needed. Schreier's story on the crunch for this game is a prime example. Crunch is a very difficult thing to hear and read about. It must be 100 times more so to experience it firsthand. I struggled with Schreier's article. I had really bought into the idea that the studio had mitigated their crunch this time around with the lessons I had read about from Uncharted 4. As a fan, I want the studio to succeed in making yet another marquee title for PlayStation. I also want the people to have a healthy work-life balance. I'm no producer. I struggled with balancing work and personal life for years during college, when I was hired as a freelance guide writer for IGN. I so desperately wanted to make it there, and would sacrifice time to make sure players knew how to collect in-game items in a timely manner pleasing to the SEO gods. I once lost a save file early in the evening, and decided to drink a few cans of Red Bull to stay up through the night and recapture and play the game so I could be back where I needed to be for the next day. I think most creative people crunch on some level. Schreier did for his first book. It can be a rush in smaller chunks. This is pebbles compared to creating a multi-million-dollar video game over the course of years. I also struggle with the fact it seems to be the developer's choice to work overtime and stay later due to a drive to make the game better. I believe some also feel peer pressure, seeing other members staying late and them making a decision to leave work sooner. If that person is making that choice, then they will have to live with the consequences that fall out from it. Maybe someone needs to make the choice for the team, though. Maybe it is time for Naughty Dog to actively decide when to close the doors for the day and tackle the game tomorrow. Hopefully, as this generation comes to a close, Naughty Dog can use the PS5 and their next project to create a fresh slate for a healthier, creative environment, one that helps employees balance their job and personal life while creating personally satisfying projects that build upon Naughty Dog's legacy. Unfortunately, the reach and impact of COVID-19 went much further than PAX East. On April 2nd, 2020, Sony announced that The Last of Us Part 2 would be delayed indefinitely. Citing logistics, such as printing discs and shipping them, Sony made the call to postpone the release so that the game could launch physically and digitally simultaneously. Naughty Dog published their own statement as well. From both Naughty Dog's statement and additional reporting from Schreier, it does sound like the studio was on track for the May 29th release date, despite having to work from home to practice physical distancing due to COVID-19. Sony did release new screenshots shortly after the announcement, but then removed them in the evening. News sites put them up before they vanished, though. They significantly showed off Joel, who had been in limited coverage before. The following day, on April 3rd, Druckmann made an appearance on the PlayStation blogcast for a brief chat with Sid Schumann. Druckmann shared insight behind the studio's reasons not to release a demo and how the team was adapting to working from home. Not even a week later, Sony actually removed the game from the PlayStation Store and began refunding customers their pre-orders. It wouldn't be long until leaks began to happen for the game, now that it was stuck in limbo. The night after the indefinite delay, a few small clips leaked online, most notably revealing a small but unique-looking gameplay mechanic. Weeks later, on the weekend of April 25th, a, quote, huge chunk of unseen gameplay, various cutscenes, the release's main menu, and what appears to be unfinished multiplayer code, end quote, leaked online. While I did watch the first leak, I stayed away from the second leak with a 39.5-foot pole. The morning of April 27th is when the massive leak became widely discussed. Rumors surrounding the cause of the second leak claim the source was a former employee upset over a payment dispute. This would be proven false by the end of the week. Naughty Dog would make a statement in regard to the leak, later in the day. Quote, "We know the last few days have been incredibly difficult for you. We feel the same. It's disappointing to see the release and sharing of pre-release footage from development. Do your best to avoid spoilers, and we ask that you don't spoil it for others. The Last of Us Part 2 will be in your hands soon. No matter what you see and hear, the final experience will be worth it." End quote. That same day, Sony would announce that June 19th, 2020 would be the new release date for The Last of Us Part 2. We may never know if the announcement came sooner than planned due to the leak the previous weekend. 3 weeks was not as long as I expected the indefinite delay to last, but having the game sooner was a bright spot on an otherwise cloudy day. On May 1st, Sony would confirm to GamesIndustry.biz that the leak did not originate from either company. The source of the leak obviously would not be identified due to an investigation. Just 2 days later, Schreier would share what he knew about the cause of the leak. According to a couple of Naughty Dog employees with direct knowledge of the event, the leak came about due to a security vulnerability in an older game's patch that allowed hackers access to Naughty Dog servers. This breach could have happened much earlier in April, since the smaller leak happened around then, but there's no telling when it actually occurred. The damage was already done. The Last of Us Part 2 went gold on May 4th, 2020, which means that the game is complete and ready to be printed onto a disc. Druckmann recorded a video that was shared on the official Naughty Dog Instagram account, with comments disabled, likely to avoid rampant spoilers polluting the post. Druckmann was emotional throughout the video. Going gold is often a key moment in development that is celebrated throughout the entire studio. But because the staff was still working from home due to COVID-19, the team was apart on the momentous day. Quote, "The last thing I will say is no matter what you have seen, or heard, or read, nothing compares to playing this thing from beginning to end. It's a video game. You got to play it." End quote, Druckmann said in the video. Even the aftermath of the leak, with all the reductive, half-baked summaries and the clickbait outrage videos, context to the story is crucial to remember. The backbone of the stories Naughty Dog tells is the power of the medium in which they tell them. Video games. The best way to experience a story is the way it was intended. Throughout May, the promotional campaign kicked into high gear. Sony began publishing a series of Inside the videos that explored different elements of The Last of Us Part 2, including story and gameplay. The footage of the developers was clearly recorded before working from home was required for Naughty Dog, and the gameplay footage was recycled from older demos. Sony also revealed an exclusive PS4 Pro console that was embossed with Ellie's moth tattoo. The limited edition system would launch the same day as the game. I may or may not have pre-ordered one. On May 26th, the press would announce that reviews for The Last of Us Part 2 would drop on June 12, 2020 at midnight, 1 week before the release date. The peak of pre-release promos would be the 23-minute State of Play, dedicated to The Last of Us Part 2, that aired on May 27, 2020. What would have normally been a day of press previews, videos, and podcasts was distilled down to a video narrated by Druckmann. The presentation gave a taste of the scope of Seattle, and displayed the refinement Naughty Dog has been able to achieve after so many years of development and iteration. It ended with nearly 10 minutes of uncut, never-before-seen gameplay. The demo also confirmed that Vita still means life in the year 2038. The Last of Us Part 2 appears to be the culmination of years of evolution in the pursuit of excellence. Naughty Dog has pushed their design language wider and wider, while keeping an obsessive eye on the little details. The game that is being released on June 19th, 2020, is not the game that would have come out 2 or 3 years after the original game, if the studio was able to keep two teams intact. This game stands on the shoulders of all the Naughty Dog PS4 titles before it, taking their lessons and experimentations to craft this long-awaited sequel. It is not a product of picking an idea after wrapping the Uncharted series, but a product of patience, dedication, and a willingness to learn and grow. It is also a game built on the backs of extremely hardworking developers, animators, producers, artists, and many, many more creators. All of Naughty Dog was unified under the goal of marrying the story and the gameplay. I don't know if it's going to be a good game. No one does yet. I can see, though, just how hard and how dedicated the team is to making a game they are proud of. I admire that. This has been the 5th part of Chasing the Stick, the history of Naughty Dog during the PS4 era. If you would like more, head on over to maxfrequency.net. The next and final episode talks about the future of Naughty Dog with the PlayStation 5.